All right, diving into a topic that's causing a lot of discussion these days, cannabis use during pregnancy. You've sent over a really interesting mix of research from trends in Canada, long-term studies, even firsthand accounts from moms. Seems like you want to kind of cut through all the noise, figure out what's the real deal here, what do we actually know about the effects and what's still unclear.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic, especially as cannabis becomes, more accepted and used. And we need to approach it, I think, with a good balance of curiosity and skepticism. Really look at the evidence.
Exactly. And speaking of evidence, one thing that kind of jumps out is this study from Ontario. It was published in JAMA back in 2019, found that self-reported cannabis use during pregnancy was linked to a higher risk of preterm birth. That's it's pretty significant, right?
Yeah, it is significant, but it is important to remember, like you said, it relied on self-reporting, which can be, can be a little bit tricky sometimes.
Right, right.
People might not always remember accurately or, even be totally honest about their use, especially given the stigma that still exists.
Right, so we can't be 100% sure it was the cannabis itself that caused those preterm births. I mean, there could have been other factors, like maybe those moms were also more likely to smoke cigarettes or have other health issues.
Exactly. And to be fair to the study authors, they did acknowledge those limitations in their paper. They even tried to use statistical methods to control for some of those confounding factors. But it's really impossible to totally eliminate that possibility that something else was contributing.
Okay, so that study gives us a possible red flag, but it's not like a slam dunk. What about other studies? Have they found similar links between cannabis use and, problems during pregnancy or birth?
Well, there's a lot of research out there, and the findings aren't always consistent across the board. Some studies have suggested there might be a link between cannabis use and things like lower birth weight
Yeah.
or lower APGAR scores, which is that quick assessment of a newborn's health right after they're born. But again, a lot of these studies have those same limitations around self-reporting and, those confounding factors that we talked about.
So it sounds like we're still kind of in the early stages of really understanding the immediate impacts on pregnancy and birth.
hmm
What about long-term effects on child development? That's what a lot of people are really worried about, right?
Absolutely. And this is where things get, even more complex
Yeah.
and where the scientific community is still having, a lot of debate.
Well, let's get into it. What do we know so far?
Well, one of the most robust studies we have is actually fairly recent. It was published in JAMA Network Open just last year in 2023, and they followed a large group of children in California. And they didn't actually find a connection between cannabis use in early pregnancy and developmental delays, at least up to 5.5 years old.
Okay, that's kind of reassuring, right?
It is. But it's important to remember that this study only looked at kids up to that certain age. And many researchers believe that the more subtle effects, of prenatal cannabis exposure might not really show up until later in childhood or even adolescence.
So we need studies that follow these kids for a longer period of time to really get the full picture.
Exactly. And we actually do have a couple of those long-term studies that are providing some valuable insights. One is the Ottawa Prenatal Perspective Study, OPPS for short. They've been following kids in Canada for decades now. And then there's the Maternal Health Practices and Child Development Study, the MHPCD, and that one's based in the U.S.
Okay, so what are they finding? Is there a clear consensus?
Well, both studies have identified some potential, cognitive and behavioral differences in children who were exposed to cannabis prenatally, but the specific findings aren't always exactly the same. And there is debate about how significant those differences really are. So, for example, the OPPS, they've noted associations with subtle deficits in things like executive function, attention, and memory in those kids who were exposed to cannabis.
Hold on. Executive function. Can you break that down a little? What does that actually look like in a child?
Yeah, sure. So executive function, it basically refers to a set of mental skills that help us plan, organize, focus our attention, and even manage our impulses. So it's kind of like our brain's control center.
Yeah.
And it's really essential for things like learning, problem solving, social interactions, all that good stuff. So if a child has deficits in executive function, they might have trouble with things like paying attention, following directions, controlling their emotions, or even just staying organized.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
And what about the MHPCD? What have they found?
They've also reported some possible impacts on verbal skills and even academic achievement in kids who were exposed to cannabis. But it's really important to emphasize, again, that these are just associations, not causations. It doesn't mean that cannabis is the sole reason for these differences.
Right. There could be a whole bunch of other things going on, just like with those studies on preterm birth.
Exactly. And these long-term studies, they face even bigger challenges when it comes to controlling for those confounding factors. Like, you're talking about following these kids for years, and there are just so many variables that could be influencing their development. Genetics, their home environment, school, peers, exposure to other substances. The list goes on and on.
So even with these long-term studies, it's like trying to solve this really complicated puzzle and you don't have all the pieces. How do researchers even begin to tease apart the effects of cannabis from everything else?
It's incredibly difficult, and that's why it's so important to be, cautious about interpreting the findings. We don't want to jump to conclusions or make these sweeping statements about the dangers of cannabis based on these studies alone.
So where does that leave us? We've got some intriguing findings, but also a lot of unanswered questions. What's the next step in the research? What are the big questions that scientists need to be tackling?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is figuring out how to better measure cannabis exposure during pregnancy. Like we said, self-reporting, it's notoriously unreliable. And even biological measures like urine tests don't always capture, the full picture of when, how much, and even what kind of cannabis a woman used.
Yeah, I could see how that would be a problem. You need really precise information if you're going to make strong conclusions.
Exactly. And another key area of research is looking at the specific effects of different cannabinoids,
Yeah.
like THC and CBD. We know that they have different effects on the body, but we don't know how those differences play out, in the context of pregnancy and fetal development.
So it's not just about like cannabis is this whole thing, but about really understanding the individual components and how they might be impacting the developing brain.
Exactly. And this research is especially important, I think, given the rising popularity of CBD products. I mean, a lot of women are turning to CBD during pregnancy to manage things like nausea or anxiety. But we don't have a clear understanding yet of its safety or potential effects on the fetus.
That makes sense. So we have this really complex web of scientific evidence. Some studies raise concerns, others provide a bit of reassurance. But amidst all this back and forth, there are real mothers out there who are making decisions about cannabis use every day. What are their experiences like? What are the challenges they're facing? Let's talk about that when we come back for part 2 of this deep dive.
Welcome back. We've been digging into all the research. Seems like there's still a lot we don't know about the effects of cannabis on developing babies.
Yeah, there is. And that uncertainty can make things really challenging for expectant mothers, I imagine.
Absolutely. Especially when you consider that there's, still kind of a stigma surrounding cannabis use, particularly during pregnancy.
You're right. It's not just about the potential risks of cannabis, but also, this fear of being labeled a bad mom or facing negative consequences for making this choice.
Exactly. And that fear can actually prevent women from seeking accurate information or having honest conversations with their doctors. They might be reluctant to disclose their cannabis use, even if they have concerns.
That's a real problem. It creates this barrier to open communication and can ultimately make it harder for women to get the support that they need.
It does, and it's important to remember that these are real women.
Yeah.
With complex lives and individual circumstances. They're not just data points in a study. They're making difficult decisions based on what they believe is best for themselves and their babies.
So what are some of the reasons these moms gave for using cannabis during pregnancy? What were they saying?
Well, a common one was managing, difficult pregnancy symptoms, especially things like nausea and vomiting.
Right.
For some women, morning sickness can be absolutely debilitating.
Oh, yeah.
And they may find that cannabis provides relief when nothing else does.
Yeah, I could definitely see how that would be a major factor. Pregnancy can be really tough on the body, and some women might feel like they've exhausted all their other options.
Right. And others talked about using cannabis to cope with stress and anxiety,
Yeah.
which, let's face it, can also be heightened during pregnancy.
Oh, sure.
They might be feeling overwhelmed by, all the changes that are happening in their bodies and in their lives. And cannabis might offer them a way to kind of relax and manage those emotions.
So for some women, it's about physical symptom relief, and for others, it's more about, their mental and emotional well-being.
Yeah.
But I imagine there's also, this perception that cannabis is more natural or safer, maybe, than prescription medications,
Yeah.
especially during pregnancy.
Yeah, that's another common theme that came up in the study. Some women expressed concerns about, about the potential risks of pharmaceuticals and felt that cannabis was a more gentle or holistic option.
That's interesting, and it highlights the need for clear, evidence-based information about the potential risks and benefits of all options, really. Both pharmaceutical and plant-based. Because if women aren't getting that information from their healthcare providers, they're likely to turn to other sources, which might not always be reliable. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to create a space where women feel comfortable, you know, discussing these issues, openly and honestly with their doctors. They need to feel supported and empowered to, to make informed decisions without fear of judgment.
It's about having those open conversations, weighing the potential risks and benefits, and finding what works best for each individual woman and her pregnancy.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And as we move forward, I think it's important to shift the focus away from just, telling women to abstain from cannabis and towards providing them with the knowledge and resources they need to make, truly informed choices.
So we've talked about the science, the stigma, the lived experiences of mothers, but there's another big piece of this puzzle that we need to explore, and that's the ethical considerations surrounding cannabis use during pregnancy. Let's delve into those complexities when we come back for part 3 of our deep dive. So we've covered a lot in this deep dive, from the science to the personal stories. And now I'm kind of curious to look ahead. What's next in this whole conversation about cannabis and pregnancy?
Well, I think with cannabis becoming, increasingly legal and accessible, we're probably only going to see more and more women using it during pregnancy.
That makes sense. So what does that mean for research and public health? How do we make sure that women have the information they need to make those informed decisions?
Well, one area of research that I think is really promising is focus on developing better ways to actually measure cannabis exposure during pregnancy.
You mean going beyond just asking women if they used cannabis?
Exactly, yeah. Right now, we rely so heavily on self-reporting, which, as we've talked about, can be, pretty unreliable. And even biological measures like urine tests don't really give us the full picture.
So we need more precise ways to determine, like, when, how much, and what type of cannabis a woman used during pregnancy.
Exactly, yeah. And if we can improve those measurement techniques, it'll give us a much clearer understanding of the actual risks and benefits.
And that kind of brings us to another hot topic, CBD. We hear so much about it these days, and I know a lot of women are turning to CBD products during pregnancy to manage things like, anxiety or nausea. What's the latest on that front?
It's definitely an area that needs more research. We still don't fully understand how CBD impacts, the developing fetus, or if there are any long-term effects.
So while CBD might be, perceived as kind of a safer option, we just don't have enough evidence yet to say for sure.
Right. And it's also important to remember that CBD products can vary, widely in terms of their quality and potency. So even if we do find that CBD is generally safe during pregnancy, we still need to figure out, what are those appropriate dosages and forms of administration.
This all kind of points to a bigger question, though. What are the ethical implications of cannabis use during pregnancy? How do we balance a woman's right to make choices about her own body with the potential risks to her developing baby?
Yeah, that's a really complex issue, and there's no easy answer. It's a conversation that needs to involve, everyone, scientists, healthcare providers, expectant mothers, their families, society as a whole.
Because ultimately it's about finding solutions that respect both, individual autonomy and the well-being of future generations.
Exactly. We need to move away from judgment and stigma and towards a more compassionate and informed approach.
Yeah. Well said. And I think that's a great note to end on. The world of cannabis and pregnancy is constantly evolving, so it's essential to stay informed and to keep those conversations going.
Absolutely. The more we learn, the better equipped we'll be to make choices that support the health and happiness of both mothers and their babies.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a truly fascinating and important topic. We hope you found it informative and insightful.
And remember, if you're pregnant or planning to become pregnant, it's always best to, talk to your doctor about any questions or concerns you have about cannabis use.
Until next time, keep learning and keep exploring.